Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon. Consortium News has a piece entitled 75 Years of NATO equals 75 Years of Denial. Just in time for its 75th anniversary, NATO has dropped its mask, and the NATO summit beginning today in Washington is one particularly illuminating as it relates to this revelation. For insight into this, let's turn to my next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Armed Struggle: Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So your thoughts on these 75 years and how the mythology of NATO still seems to be carrying the day?
Well, NATO has been a disaster for Africa in particular. Ostensibly, it was established in 1949, as the saying went, to keep the U.S. in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. Now, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, one would have thought that NATO had lost its reason for being. But that ignores the wider point that NATO was seen as a sort of collective enterprise for the imperialist countries under the guidance and leadership of imperialist country number one, speaking of the United States of America. And with regard to the imperialist countries, it's been essential to keep a stranglehold on Africa, particularly the vast natural resources of Africa, including oil in formerly British-controlled Nigeria, oil in formerly Portuguese-controlled Angola, natural gas in formerly French-controlled Algeria. Now, we see the explosion of these tensions and contradictions in 1956 when Israel, along with Britain and France, seek to overthrow G.A. Nasser in Cairo, Egypt, in order to seize control of one of the major choke points on planet Earth, speaking of the Suez Canal. Not to mention the fact that Nasser's Egypt was supporting liberation movements in Kenya to the south and Algeria to the west. It took a threat not only from U.S. imperialism, which thought it should have been the ringleader of this bunch of thieves, but also a demand from Moscow to get these brigands to retreat. And of course, we all know that Britain drew the lesson that it had to tie itself closer to Uncle Sam. France drew an opposing lesson that it had to develop its nuclear facilities and seek distance from U.S. imperialism. And of course, Israel cozied ever closer to U.S. imperialism. And so we see then, when France got bogged down in Algeria, we saw that U.S. imperialism sought to pose as a sort of anti-colonial force by seeking to pull the rug out from under France and Algeria, which contributed not only to the election of the maestro in that particular fraudulent scenario, speaking of Senator then President John F. Kennedy, joining the White House, coming to the White House in 1960, but it also led to Algerian independence in 1962. France did not draw the appropriate lesson because, of course, a few years previously, it was driven out of Guinea-Conakry in West Africa, but in vengeance, it sought to destroy the economy under Sékou Touré by breaking down typewriters and breaking light bulbs and destroying toilets. It was really monstrous what they sought to do. And that was followed, of course, in the 1970s when Portugal was being driven out of Angola and Mozambique. And, of course, accompanied by the apartheid authorities having to give up power in 1994. Now, doing all of these particular escapades, we see that Portugal, a stalwart member of NATO, was supported by its comrades, particularly the United States of America. And the same holds true for apartheid South Africa. Now, NATO reaches a boiling point in 2011 when it overthrows Gaddafi in Libya. He's murdered on camera. Of course, Gaddafi was trying to knock together a strengthened African Union with its own currency, its own strengthen parliament, etc. But even with the obscenity of what happened in Libya in 2011, perhaps NATO's escapades and adventures in West Asia were probably even more disastrous. I'm thinking of the NATO support, particularly the U.S. imperialism support for the so-called Six-Day War in 1967 with Israel attacking the Arab countries, particularly, once again, Nasser's Egypt, despite the fact that Israel attacks a U.S. ship, the USS Liberty, in broad daylight for various reasons that remain murky. The United States continued to support Israel, not least because of the potency of the Zionist lobby, which flexed its muscles once again in 1973, when once again Israel found itself at war, and once again U.S. imperialism sought to bail out Israel, which it did, although it's unclear whether they can do the same in 2024. But in terms of all of these escapades, adventures, and misdeeds in Asia, perhaps Afghanistan takes pride of place. Even before the Soviet intervention in December 1979, you saw the United States cozying up to forces it said it was sworn to oppose. Speaking of religious zealots, that is a severe wound not only to Afghanistan, which before the withdrawal of Soviet troops a decade later in 1989 was on the path to modernization in every sense of that term. But with the U.S. support for religious zealots, Afghanistan went quickly downhill to the point where the zealots then turned on the United States, as we well know, on September 11, 2001, when they attacked New York and Washington. Today, of course, NATO is scrambling because you have an alliance of Sahel states, formerly French colonies, speaking of Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, that have united together in a bloc, kicking out U.S. forces, kicking out French forces, and also thumbing its nose at the regional giant, speaking of Nigeria, and its declining economic community of West African states. Likewise, in another former French colony, speaking of Congo-Brazzaville, not to be confused with Congo-Kinshasa, the larger Congo, this oil-rich nation, which has been in the vanguard historically, recall its close relationship with the Black Panther Party, which I detail in my aforementioned book that you so kindly mentioned. Mm-hmm. But during the time of French occupation by the Germans, you saw that Congo-Brazzaville was the headquarters for anti-Nazi Frenchmen. And so we took with keen interest the site.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
We took with keen interest the site of the current leader of Congo-Brazzaville, supping with President Putin just a few days ago in Moscow. So as NATO begins to mark its 75th anniversary, it's easy to see that it has one foot on a banana peel. It's unclear whether or not it will mark its centenary, its 100th anniversary, but do not be surprised if it goes into decline and liquidation sooner rather than later.
And when the votes were tallied, the French were surprised that Marine Le Pen didn't carry the day and her far-right party didn't carry the day, that the left clinched power and Emmanuel Macron still remains a kingmaker. And we know, of course, the results in Britain, and that was pretty much predicted as Rishi Sunak has been sent to the woodshed. Your thoughts on the messages that are coming from Britain and coming from France?
Well, the message actually ties into the previous point. That is to say that the ruling classes in both London and Paris basically ignored their own national interests and followed U.S. imperialism when U.S. imperialism insisted on German reunification circa 1990. Recall that both Britain and France have fought repeated wars with Germany in the 20th century, and strengthening Germany was not necessarily in the national interests of Britain and France. And you can draw a straight line from German reunification, which then strengthens Germany's hand in the European Union, to British withdrawal from the European Union in 2016 and protests against this strength. And likewise, the leader of the left in France, Mélenchon, has been cited in German media, speaking of Deutsche Welle, is saying that he hates Germany. That might be an overstatement, but I'm sure Washington is paying attention to what he bruited a few years ago when he suggested that it would be in French national interest to ally with Russia against the interests of U.S. imperialism. So these elections are a political earthquake, not only with regard to the interests of U.S. imperialism, but also for the interests of NATO. Because with the left gaining strength in the French parliament, and even though President Macron, under the Constitution, has a certain amount of latitude in terms of directing foreign policy, it's going to be very difficult to do when the number one force politically in France is a left dominated by communists, socialists, Greens, and of course, Mr. Mélenchon.
And we now have photographs of Indian President Modi in Russia, meeting with President Putin and strengthening the ties between the two countries. I would have to say, much to the dismay of the United States.
Much to the dismay of the United States, indeed. Of course, U.S. imperialism is counting on India to be a sort of cat's paw manipulated against China. But that's going to be difficult to do given this three-cornered relationship between India, China, and Russia, which you saw manifested a few days ago at the summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which, as this title suggests, China plays a preeminent role. It's viewed popularly as a counterpoint to NATO. And I dare say that Modi in Moscow is causing conniptions and nightmares in Washington, because it's going to be very difficult to manipulate India against China going forward, not to mention the fact that India is benefiting handsomely from being a middleman in terms of the Russian oil trade, marking up that oil and then sending it back to Western Europe at a handsome profit.
And we have just about 30 seconds, and I was making a point with another guest that we've got Peru going to the president of Peru going to meet with President Xi in China. You've got Modi strengthening ties with President Putin and Russia. All of this based on common interest. All of this based on trade. And the United States brings warmongers to the United States to monger more war.
Not only that, but then, of course, you have two parties in the United States. Republicans, a party of civil war and fascism. The Democrats, a party of imperialism and foreign intervention. With the latter decomposing as we speak, one would expect the Congressional Black Caucus to be behind the attempt to overthrow Mr. Biden. But because of the distrust internally within the Democratic Party, with many of the black bloc feeling that they do not trust altogether those who are seeking to dislodge Mr. Biden, because they think that if the Democrats lose, then they'll just blame the next in line, Kamala Harris, and her black supporters for their tremendous loss. So that is a major structural weakness of U.S. imperialism, this internal distrust within the major constituencies of the Democratic Party, not to mention the fact that structurally and historically, you've had two parties in this country. And oftentimes they flip and switch roles. That is to say, the Republicans today, the party of fascism, the Civil War, and the Democrats, the party of imperialism and foreign intervention.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis. I look forward to having